Now, Ferdinand, you spoke at length on the Indonesian scene. What do you see as the three biggest trends that will shape the future of the Indonesian market?
I mentioned that electrification of Indonesia is the primary driver for the bulk cargo, either it be dry bulk or liquid bulk. So I think the key as far as what trends will develop the market going forward is how much adoption the Indonesian government makes of alternative fuels, and that will be the key.
What do you think should be the key focus areas for vendors in terms of dealing with Indonesia?
I think people shouldn't be afraid of entering the Indonesian market. A lot of times people enter the Indonesian market and they want to play it safe because it's foreign to them. So they go through sort of an agent or a distributor, but that is limiting themselves. If you look at other technology firms or sort of new foreign players who come into Indonesia, the ones that are most successful are who make a significant investment in the country rather than going through agents or sort of third-party distributors, people who they show that service and sort of the reputation is key in Indonesia, and if you want to develop sort of your products. So if you were just going there sort of not really directly, but playing it safe, you won't get much traction. So if you want to really grow in Indonesia, it has to be a significant investment and not through just sort of a marketing agent or something.
So that said, significant investments, a commitment, but how truly open for international tug business interests is Indonesia?
Well, that depends. Adoption of technology and sort of foreign built, I don't think either are an issue. It just has to do with ownership. So as long as the ownership is Indonesian, there's no restraints with regards of adopting technology or even where you're building the tugs. Actually, you can import foreign-made tugs and reflag them into Indonesia, and you'll get tax benefits. So there's no sort of, I think, obstacles to adopting new technology or building the tugs abroad, maybe in another country. It's completely open. It's just a matter, restrictions only the ownership.
So that said, do you think there'll still be a good demand for tug and barge as a means of transporting coal in Indonesia in the near future, or will self-propelled barges be the preferred option?
Again, I've mentioned we've already done a very in-depth analysis because we own over 80 tugboats ourselves, and we were looking at investing in self-propelled. But self-propelled, there are, because of the higher capital costs, the higher operating costs, there are two main drivers that you need in order for it to be successful. One I mentioned during the presentation, and that's you need dedicated loading and discharge facilities. That way you maximize the amount of time that you're actually sort of using the more expensive equipment. If you're using public facilities, you will lose all of the, you will not be able to get the necessary sort of cycle time improvements that you need in order to warrant the additional investment. So one is you need dedicated jetties that is very extremely sort of beneficial to using self-propelled. The other one is you have to have significant distance as well, because you can't use these for sort of the shorter routes from South Kalimantan to the northern part of the Java Sea. You have to look at sort of large, sort of longer voyages, probably at least 600 nautical miles or further before it makes sense to use to get the additional speed with the self-propelled, or to maximize the additional speed of the self-propelled barges.
Staying on the technical, we see certainly in the Europe and the Americas high demand for higher bollard pull. Do you see a similar trend in Indonesia, or is it the case that the BP requirement for up to 65 tons remains?
Indonesia, a lot of times with regards to the requirements, they will follow the industry standard or the international standard. So if that's something that is being done as a drive for adoption in other markets such as Singapore or Malaysia, I think in eventuality, Indonesia will also adopt it as well.
We spoke a lot about coal and that as a driver. Let's talk about LNG for a moment. What do you see as the role of cryogenic articulated barges, perhaps in place of regasification terminals in LNG ships in Indonesia?
In the place of regasification, I know a little bit about how the LNG setup is going to work going forward. And with regards to regasification, most of it will be provided by the power plant itself. So the power plant that will be receiving LNG will have their own regasification as part of their sort of dual fuel turbine. So the turbine and the regas is the responsibility of the purchaser or the power plant in this case. For service providers, they're more focused on the distribution by the marine distribution, as well as the storage facilities and sort of jetty infrastructure that has to be put in place. But as far as the regas, that's considered part of the core competency of the power plant itself. So that's not a requirement for a service provider to come in and have to provide. Service provider will just focus on the storage and the distribution of the LNG, but will not be involved in the regas or sort of the generation.
So no role for cryogenic articulated barges?
There is a role, but I think the question mentioned with regards to replacing regas, and I don't think you need to replace regas. Cryogenic tanks will be used, but not because they will replace regas. You will not need a regasification unit on board. Basically, they're going to be very simple setups. It's basically some sort of storage capacity, either the cylinder tanks or the rectangular tanks in small scale, probably carrying about approximately 5,000 cubic meter or smaller because of the draft limitations in a lot of the power plants that will be using LNG. So these will be small size barges. They can be self-propelled, preferably self-propelled, is meant just because of safety concerns. But then they will just basically just storage and pumping systems. Then they would sort of have to have the correct manifolds for the receiving terminal, as well as the discharging, which would be much simpler because you're setting up the discharging to your own onshore storage as well. So it's not a complicated thing. It will be needed, but it's not at the level of sophistication, say, for larger vessels or export.
And finally, you mentioned safety. What steps are being taken on the Indonesian scene to boost the level of tug operations, and in particular the safety of tug operations?
I'm not involved in that, so I'm not following the regulations on safety. What they have done is they have increased sort of the requirements on crewing certification. So previously, you could get by on operating tugs at the very minimal level of sort of seaman certification and sort of diploma. But now they have categorized it into two different levels. One, if you're still doing the normal coastal transshipment, you can still get by on the lower certification and diploma status and training. But now when things are entering sort of the inter-island sort of voyages, those people are required to have higher and significant and incrementally higher sort of certifications and diplomas. So I think the way they're handling is not so much on sort of regulation from an industry standpoint, but more so of enforcement of higher criteria for the crew for crewing.